Here, the past is not rushed. It drifts. It unfolds like candlelight on old parchment, where every shadow hides a tale and every whisper of history is softened into lullaby. This channel is for wanderers of the night, for those who find comfort in stories, not noise. For those who wish to sink into the gentle strangeness of history, told not as a lecture, but as a dream. Sometimes we speak of kings and empires. Sometimes of forgotten saints, of merchants, of poets, of bakers, and ghosts. And sometimes of the curious numbers historians left behind, like body counts so vast they sound more like legends than records. If you stay, let these stories be your company. Let them guide you into quiet, into calm, into sleep. Because history is not only in the books. It lingers in the hush between words, waiting for you to close your eyes. Cherry Blossom, this is Bedtime Sleepy Historian, where the past comes gently. The historian's numbers. Numbers, dear listener, are strange creatures. They march across parchment like disciplined soldiers, precise in shape yet slippery in meaning. In ancient histories, especially, they swell and stretch until they look less like fact and more like myth. Chroniclers scribbled them with steady hands but not always steady minds, and so we are left with records of body counts that stagger belief. Imagine a dusty scroll being unrolled in the flickering lamplight of a temple scribe. His ink brush hesitates, then writes, 40,000 slain. Not 39, not 41. 40,000. As if he had stood on the battlefield himself with a tally board, scratching lines for every fall of a sword. Of course, he hadn't. The number was a performance, a way of saying, this victory was so great, only an impossible figure could contain it. Take the Battle of Cannae, for instance. Rome, that tireless wolf of empire, faced Hannibal of Carthage in 216 BC. Ancient writers claimed as many as 70,000 Romans perished in a single day. To picture it is dizzying, an entire city emptied of men, swallowed by dust and steel. Whether the number is true hardly mattered, it was the enormity that counted. Rome wept, Carthage triumphed, the chroniclers sharpened their pens. And yet, for every terrifying sum, there is a soft irony. The numbers that once roared now drift into bedtime whispers. They are too vast to be real, too heavy to carry into sleep. They have become almost dreamlike, echoes of pride, fear, and memory exaggerated beyond recognition. So tonight, we will wander through these swollen tallies, these body counts, of ancient history. Not to glorify them, but to marvel at how the human need for story often outnumbers the truth itself. The million men of Xerxes. If the Romans gave us numbers to awe, the Persians gave us numbers to overwhelm. When Herodotus, that great wanderer of words, set quill to papyrus in the 5th century BC, he told of King Xerxes marching to Greece with an army so vast it sounded like the tide itself had risen to war. The figure? Over 2 million men. Yes, 2 million. Enough to darken the land, enough to drink rivers dry, quite literally, Herodotus claimed. The army was said to drain whole streams in an afternoon, leaving cracked riverbeds behind like discarded skins of serpents. They marched across Asia, a human sea of sandals and dust, and when they crossed the Hellespont, Xerxes had pontoon bridges built from boats lashed together, as if even nature's waters could be shackled into submission. But here is the gentle absurdity. Could 2 million men truly have marched? Modern historians frown, shake their heads, and scribble their revisions. Perhaps it was closer to 200,000. Perhaps less. Ancient numbers, after all, were often more about mood than mathematics. To write 2 million was to say, this was no mere army. This was the world itself bearing down upon Greece. And when those 2 million, whether true or imagined, met the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the story transformed into something eternal. Few against many. Drops of blood against the crashing wave. The body counts became less about arithmetic and more about meaning. Still, the numbers linger. 2,000,000 soldiers, marching like thunder. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the imagined footsteps, though in truth, it may have been fewer, much fewer. Yet the exaggeration remains stubborn as legend. Numbers do not shrink once they are written. They stay, echoing through time like a boast whispered in the dark. Rivers read in ancient China. If Greece and Rome painted numbers to impress, China carved them into stone to endure. The chronicles of the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC, read less like history and more like an accountant's nightmare. Battles were not merely fights, they were vast reckonings, where the fate of kingdoms was weighed not in treaties but in piles of the dead. Consider the Battle of Chongping in 260 BC, between the state of Qin and the state of Zhao. The records claim a figure so colossal it almost bends the quill that writes it: 450,000 Zhao soldiers executed after surrender. Nearly 500,000 men, said to have been buried alive in mass trenches. It is a number so heavy it almost collapses under its own weight. Could the ground itself have held them? Could hands with shovels have worked so quickly? Was it logistically possible, or was it, perhaps, an emperor's way of declaring, "Behold, this victory is beyond imagining"? In the silence of centuries, one wonders not only about the soldiers but about the scribes who wrote such figures. Did they hesitate before setting down 450,000? Did they feel the absurdity, the impossibility, even as they obeyed the command of rulers who demanded enormity? Or did they, too, believe? What we know is this: the Qin did win, the Zhao did fall, and in the end the Qin would unify China beneath their banner. Numbers here were not just boasts. They were instruments of terror, meant to echo through villages and farmhouses, to make children grow silent at the mention of the Qin name. And yet, in the quiet of night, when these numbers are read again under the lamp of history, they feel strangely ghostly. The mass graves are hard to find, the precise truth uncertain. What remains is the number itself, an unsteady monument. 500,000 shadows, pressed into a single figure that may or may not have been real. Alexander's Mountains of the Dead. When Alexander of Macedon strode eastward, he carried not only spears and ambition but also the peculiar arithmetic of empire. Victories were measured not in towns taken or kings subdued, but in the swelling heap of the fallen. His chroniclers, eager to turn conquest into poetry, sharpened their numbers until they glittered like jewels. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, where Alexander met Darius III of Persia, the accounts differ wildly. One source whispers of 40,000 Persian dead, another declares 300,000. The Greeks themselves? Supposedly only a few hundred, perhaps 1,000, if we believe the story told by men who loved their king. In these retellings, Alexander is no mere general but a demigod, scattering armies with the flick of his wrist, while his enemies dissolve like mist. And then there was the march into India. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, he fought King Porus, who rode a towering elephant and commanded thousands. The records claim 20,000 Indian soldiers killed, elephants brought low, and chariots splintered into kindling. The numbers, once again, rise to myth. Were they precise? Almost certainly not. But they carried a message. Wherever Alexander walked, the earth itself seemed to bleed in proportion to his greatness. It was a strange economy, numbers as a currency of all. The greater the heap of corpses described, the brighter the legend of Alexander grew. Even when his men grew weary, refusing to march further into Asia, the stories still kept the scale of their victories enormous. What's left now are not the bodies but the tallies. Cities sacked, armies destroyed, rivers red. The mountains of the dead, as one chronicler put it, were more rhetorical than literal, but rhetoric has a way of outliving the truth. Alexander himself died young, not yet 33, but the body counts assigned to his name continue to wander across the centuries like shadows he never quite outran. Rome and Carthage, body counts as strategy. Few rivalries in history produce numbers as staggering as the Punic Wars. Rome and Carthage locked in a struggle that spanned more than a century. These were not skirmishes. These were continental earthquakes, each side sending armies into the field so vast that their losses read like entire populations erased. Take the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, where Hannibal of Carthage performed what many still call the most brilliant tactical maneuver in history. The Roman legions, nearly 80,000 strong, marched in with the confidence of empire. Hannibal encircled them with a smaller force, drawing them in, squeezing the center until it broke. When the day ended, Roman sources claimed 50,000 to 70,000 Romans killed in a single afternoon. Imagine the plain littered with bodies, the dust soaked dark with blood, the silence of 70,000 men no longer breathing. Could such a number be true? Even modern scholars squint at it, knowing that ancient writers loved to double, even triple their figures. But whether 50,000 or 20,000, the meaning was the same. The Romans had suffered a loss so colossal it became myth. And Rome, ever practical, responded not only with more soldiers but with more numbers. In later accounts, they minimized their defeats and inflated Carthage's. Scipio Africanus, the Roman general who eventually defeated Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC, was praised with counts that dwarfed his rivals. The Carthaginians, according to Roman scribes, fell by the tens of thousands, while Roman losses barely scratched the parchment. It was, as always, less about accuracy and more about narrative. To the Romans, numbers were propaganda, sharpened weapons that struck long after swords went dull. To be Roman was to survive catastrophe, to outlast, impossible, body counts, and to bury your enemies beneath exaggerated heaps of their own dead. And yet if one were to walk those fields now, Cannae, Zama, the ground would feel strangely quiet. The numbers live on, but the bones have mostly melted into the soil, leaving behind only dust, whispers, and the uneasy thought that perhaps the truth of war lies somewhere smaller and more human than the swollen figures suggest. Ashoka and the River of Corpses. In the 3rd century BC, in the heart of India, Emperor Ashoka of the Mauryan dynasty waged a war so devastating that even he could not bear its aftermath. His empire stretched wide, hungry for more, and the kingdom of Kalinga stood in his path. The Battle of Kalinga, around 261 BC, was said to have drowned the land in blood. Chroniclers record 100,000 slain outright, 150,000 carried away as captives, and countless thousands more dying from wounds, famine, and displacement. 250,000 souls, torn from life or torn from home, all because one emperor wanted dominion over a fertile strip of land. What makes Ashoka's numbers so haunting is not just their scale, but what followed. For once, the numbers were not propaganda, not polished for glory, but kept as a tally of guilt. Ashoka himself, after touring the battlefield strewn with corpses, confessed that the sight broke him. The wails of widows and orphans, the stench of rivers clogged with bodies, turned victory into horror. In his famous rock edicts, inscriptions carved into stone throughout his empire, Ashoka did something rare. He admitted regret. He declared that conquest by the sword was meaningless, that true conquest was through dharma, or righteous living. From that moment on, he renounced violence and spread Buddhism, turning the machinery of empire into one of compassion, at least in word and intent. But the numbers remain. 100,000 killed. It is a figure that looms like a storm cloud in the annals of ancient history. Was it precise? Almost certainly not. Yet even if the true toll were halved, or halved again, it still stands as one of the bloodiest episodes of the ancient world. Ashoka's transformation reminds us of something unusual. For once, a body count was not used to glorify a ruler, but to condemn him, to remind future generations that greatness built upon corpses was, in the end, no greatness at all. Hellenistic blood feuds, the forgotten body counts. After Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, his empire fractured like a shattered amphora. Out of its pieces rose the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, the Antigonids, dynasties born from generals who once dined together but now sent tens of thousands to kill one another. These wars rarely received the same fame as Rome's battles or Ashoka's remorse, but their body counts, though scattered across half-lost chronicles, were no less chilling. Take the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC. Here, the Ptolemaic Egyptians under Ptolemy IV clashed with Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire in one of antiquity's largest set-piece battles. Ancient accounts describe over 120,000 soldiers arrayed across the desert plain, elephants trumpeting in both ranks, dust spiraling into the sky like a curtain drawn over the sun. The numbers claimed are staggering: 10,000 dead on Antiochus's side, 15,000 captured, and 2,000 slain among Ptolemy's forces. Even if we temper the figures for exaggeration, we still face the image of entire cities' worth of men cut down or shackled in a single day. And this was only one engagement among many. But unlike the Romans, who kept their casualty numbers as part of their patriotic mythology, or Ashoka, who carved his guilt into stone, the Hellenistic kings treated numbers as fleeting ink. They boasted of elephants crushed under spear points, of rivers running red, of tens of thousands scattered like leaves, but rarely did they hold on to the memory. Victory was celebrated, losses forgotten, and the dead reduced to placeholders in speeches of glory. That may be why these wars feel so ghostly now. Their body counts survive in fragments, numbers without faces, echoes of men whose bones were left beneath shifting desert sands or on rocky hillsides in Asia Minor. If Rome turned body counts into propaganda and Ashoka into repentance, the Hellenistic kings turned them into silence. The dead were just statistics, quickly buried in the next campaign. And yet, when we look at the tallies, it is hard not to see a pattern repeating: the ancient world's appetite for colossal clashes, where tens of thousands could die in an afternoon, and where human life, when multiplied by the thousands, was both weapon and waste. The rivers ran red, China's warring states and Qin brutality. If the Mediterranean and India counted their dead in tens of thousands, ancient China's warring states and early imperial wars escalated the arithmetic to almost unimaginable extremes. Here, numbers were recorded not only as triumphs but as warnings, engraved in bamboo slips, sung in chronicles, whispered as curses across generations. One of the most infamous episodes came at the end of the Battle of Changping in 260 BC. The state of Qin, hungry for dominance over rival Zhao, unleashed its armies under General Bai Qi. For 3 years the two powers wrestled, trading victories and starvation sieges. At last, the Qin army cut off Zhao's supplies, forcing 400,000 Zhao soldiers to surrender. What followed is one of history's darkest body counts. Bai Qi, unwilling to feed or risk revolt from such a massive prisoner force, ordered the captives executed. Some records claim they were buried alive in pits, hundreds of thousands of men entombed beneath the earth, their swords and spears still at their sides, their cries swallowed by silence. Even if the figures are inflated, the massacre stands as one of the largest deliberate slaughters in antiquity. Qin would rise from such brutality to unify China, but its unification was soaked in blood. Later campaigns against Zhu Yan, and she would claim tens of thousands more. The Battle of Julu in 207 BC, fought between the Qin and the rebel forces of Chu, saw yet another annihilation, over 200,000 Qin soldiers reportedly executed after surrender. Mass killings became almost ritualistic, the body counts a grim currency of power. Unlike Ashoka, there was no public remorse. Unlike the Greeks, there was no quick forgetting. In Chinese memory, the scale of death became legend, etched into dynastic histories as lessons of both terror and inevitability. Numbers so vast that they threatened to blur into abstraction, 400,000 here, 200,000 there, yet behind every digit was a soldier, a son, a father whose life ended in the pitiless churn of empire building. In these campaigns, we see the clearest glimpse of what body counts meant in the ancient world, not mere statistics, but the deliberate erasure of whole communities, wielded as both tactic and message. Victory was measured not just in land gained, but in how thoroughly the enemy was reduced to corpses. When Rome devoured itself, civil wars and rivers of blood. If Hannibal had been Rome's nightmare, the 1st century BC brought something even darker. Rome's talent for killing turned inward. The Republic, fattened on conquest, began to collapse under the weight of its own ambition. And in the struggles between Marius, Sulla, Caesar, and Pompey, the streets, fields, and even sacred temples of Rome became graveyards. The body counts here are staggering, though often blurred in the chaos of civil war. At the Battle of the Colline Gate, 82 BC, when Sulla fought to cement his dictatorship, as many as 50,000 men were slain in a single day outside Rome's walls. Some accounts describe corpses piled against the city gates, so high they became barricades themselves. Yet Sulla's real massacre came afterward. He drew up lists, proscriptions, of those deemed enemies of the state. Their names were posted in the forum, and anyone could kill them for reward. Thousands were murdered, their estates seized, their families ruined. Ancient estimates suggest over 9,000 citizens executed, not counting slaves or foreigners. Rome's civil bloodletting had become systematic. A generation later, Julius Caesar and Pompey repeated the cycle on an even greater scale. At Pharsalus, 48 BC, Caesar's legions crushed Pompey's army, killing perhaps 30,000 in one afternoon. These were not Gauls or Numidians. They were Romans, Italians, men who once shared festivals, markets, and streets. Caesar reportedly wept after the battle, yet the numbers do not weep. They only accumulate. And still, the killing was not done. The Battle of Philippi, 42 BC, where the forces of Octavian and Antony fought Brutus and Cassius, saw 40,000 dead left sprawled across Macedonian plains. Just a decade later, Actium, 31 BC, would claim tens of thousands more, sealing Rome's transformation from republic to empire. The irony of Rome's civil wars is that the death tolls rivaled or surpassed the foreign wars that built the republic. More Romans died at the hands of their fellow citizens than at the spears of Hannibal or the swords of Carthage. The greatest military machine of antiquity discovered that its most dangerous enemy was itself. And in this turning of the blade inward, we glimpse a truth of ancient history. Empires rise by conquest, but they often collapse by self-slaughter. Rome was too powerful to fall outright in that century, but it would never again be the republic it once claimed to be. Rome at full throttle, the body counts of empire. When Rome emerged from its civil wars, it was no longer a republic but an empire. And an empire needs conquests to feed its machine, tribute to pour into coffers, slaves to till its fields, captives to fill its arenas. The legions, disciplined and relentless, marched farther than ever, carving their way across landscapes whose names still echo in history: Dacia, Parthia, Germania, Britannia. Each campaign was written in blood. Under Emperor Trajan, r. 98 to 117 C, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent. His wars in Dacia, modern-day Romania, were brutal beyond measure. The Dacians were fierce fighters, led by their king, Decebalus. 2 campaigns were required to subdue them, and the death toll staggered even Roman chroniclers. Ancient estimates suggest tens of thousands of Dacians slain, perhaps 40,000 to 50,000, with survivors sold into slavery. Trajan's column in Rome still spirals upward with carved scenes of the slaughter, villages burning, warriors skewered, women dragged into chains. Trajan then turned east, against the Parthians. At Ctesiphon in 116 C, the Roman legion stormed the great city on the Tigris, sacking it with such ferocity that even Roman writers flinched. How many died? Some sources suggest 100,000 or more, though the numbers blur between battle and massacre. Rome had reached the Persian Gulf, but at a cost of rivers of blood. Other emperors sought glory in Germania, where the forests swallowed men whole. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, spent much of his reign locked in the Marcomannic Wars. His meditations, those quiet, stoic musings, were penned in war tents surrounded by the stink of death. Tens of thousands of Germanic tribesmen were killed or enslaved, and Roman losses, too, were immense. Marcus may have been gentle in philosophy, but in practice, he presided over years of ceaseless carnage. And then there were the Jewish wars. In 66 to 73 C, during the reign of Vespasian and his son Titus, rebellion flared in Judea. The Roman response was merciless. At the siege of Jerusalem in 70 C, Josephus, the Jewish historian turned Roman chronicler, claimed 1.1 million people perished, many from famine, fire, and massacre, with 97,000 enslaved. Even if exaggerated, the numbers remain staggering. The temple itself was set aflame, its treasures paraded through Rome as proof of conquest, while its people lay dead in the streets. Rome at its peak was not just an empire of marble and law but also an empire of bodies. Its monuments were raised by slaves taken from butchered nations, its triumphs celebrated with chains of captives trailing through the streets. The numbers told to justify the glory were almost beyond imagination. And yet, Rome did not question the arithmetic. To be Roman was to conquer, and to conquer was to count the dead. The rivers ran red, China's ancient body counts. If Rome's numbers startled, the records from ancient China astonish in another register entirely. For in the vast valleys of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, war did not come in skirmishes or even single campaigns. It arrived like floods, overwhelming whole provinces, sweeping millions into its current. The earliest example comes with the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC. That centuries-long struggle of kingdoms clawing at one another before the Qin dynasty unified China. Battles were fought on a scale Europe could scarcely imagine. Chroniclers spoke of armies numbering hundreds of thousands on each side, and death tolls soaring into 6 figures per engagement. The Battle of Chongping, 260 BC, between Qin and Zhao, stands as a grim monument to this bloodletting. Qin General Bai Qi captured 400,000 Zhao soldiers, and executed nearly all of them, buried alive in mass graves. The ground itself was said to tremble for days after, as though it too recoiled. When Qin finally triumphed, it built its empire on bones. The very first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, ordered monumental projects, the Great Wall, roads, palaces, constructed by forced labor. Some estimates suggest hundreds of thousands died under the weight of his ambitions, bodies interred within the stones themselves. Yet the greatest bloodletting came later, during rebellions. The Three Kingdoms period, 220 to 280 C, romanticized today in novels and opera, was in truth an age of annihilation. The fall of the Han dynasty plunged China into chaos, and the population, perhaps 50 to 60 million at its peak, was slashed by half. Drought, plague, famine, and ceaseless battle carried away tens of millions. Whole counties vanished from the census, swallowed by the maw of war. Then came the Lushan Rebellion, 755 to 763 C, in the Tang dynasty, a conflict so devastating it was remembered as the breaking of an age. A general turned rebel declared himself emperor, and for nearly 8 years, China burned. The fighting, famine, and disease that followed were said to have killed up to 36 million people, 2/3 of the empire's population by some counts. Even if exaggerated, modern historians agree the losses were catastrophic beyond comprehension, dwarfing anything the Mediterranean world had ever seen. The chroniclers of China recorded these numbers with a kind of bureaucratic coldness. Registers, censuses, tax rolls, they measured bodies as they would grain. When 1 million were lost, the records simply noted the absence, as if whole villages had been erased with a brushstroke. The great dynasties rose and fell on such mathematics. For China, numbers were not legend but ledger. And yet, when the figures climbed into the millions, they began to acquire the same unreality as myth. How does one grieve for 30 million dead? How does a people rebuild after half their kin are gone? The silence in the records is answer enough. Ashoka's awakening, when body counts changed a king. Among the empires of the East, few rulers left such a paradoxical legacy as Ashoka the Great of India's Mauryan dynasty. His reign, which began around 268 BC, shines with contradiction, remembered both as one of the bloodiest conquerors and one of the gentlest kings. The contradiction begins at Kalinga, a small but defiant kingdom on the eastern coast. Ashoka, newly enthroned and hungry to expand, marched his armies there in the 260s BC. What followed was a slaughter so appalling that it still haunts the pages of Indian history. By some accounts, 100,000 were killed in battle, 150,000 deported, and countless more left to die of famine and ruin. The battlefield was said to have turned into a plain of carrion, where the air itself soured from the weight of the dead. Yet here lies the strange turn. Ashoka was shaken. Perhaps it was the sight of mothers wandering among the bodies, or the rivers clogged with corpses. Whatever the moment, it struck the emperor deeply. Unlike Alexander, who pressed ever onward, Ashoka recoiled. He abandoned the sword for the teachings of the Buddha. From then on, he sought to govern not by conquest but by dharma, moral law. His edicts, carved into stone pillars across the subcontinent, declared a new vision: compassion for all living beings, tolerance of all sects, kindness even to animals. He ordered the planting of shade trees, the digging of wells, the building of rest houses for travelers. Where once he had destroyed, he now sought to heal. And yet the paradox remains. Ashoka's transformation, noble as it was, sprang from a body count so high that its echoes reverberated for generations. The corpses of Kalinga were the soil in which his gentleness grew. His story is a reminder that sometimes peace arrives not as a gift, but as an aftershock of horror. Centuries later, other rulers in India would tally their own grim numbers. The Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals waged wars that sometimes swept away tens of thousands in a single campaign. Chroniclers of the Mongol incursions into India wrote of pyramids of skulls outside Delhi's gates. But Ashoka remained singular, the emperor who stared at his body count and changed. His story whispers across time that even the cruelest arithmetic of history can yield a different sum, not just conquest, but conscience. The Mongol arithmetic of death. If ever there were masters of turning body counts into legend, it was the Mongols. Genghis Khan and his heirs carved an empire across the 13th century that stretched from the Pacific shores of China to the banks of the Danube. To the conquered, they were not merely warriors. They were a storm of death, tallying ruin on a scale so vast it defies imagination. At Nishapur in 1221, when a Mongol prince was killed during the siege, the army's fury erupted. Chroniclers claimed the slaughter that followed took hundreds of thousands of lives. One Persian account records 1.7 million, though the figure is almost certainly inflated. Still, Whether the number was 100,000 or 10 times that, the story endures: streets choked with corpses, entire quarters burned, blood soaking the soil. In Herat, the same fate. In Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Mongols stormed through in 1258 under Hulagu Khan. The death toll there is said to have reached 200,000 to 1,000,000, depending on which trembling hand held the pen. The city of books became a city of corpses. The Tigris ran black with ink from the libraries tossed into its waters, and red with blood from those who had once read them. Even in Europe, tales of Mongol destruction carried the weight of ghost stories. When Batu Khan and his horsemen rode into Hungary in 1241, they annihilated the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi. Chroniclers speak of 70,000 slain in a single day. Villages across the plain were left as smoking husks, while survivors whispered of horsemen who moved like shadows and arrows that blotted out the sky. Yet, curiously, the Mongols also valued precision, at least in reputation. Their commanders understood that terror was a weapon. If one city resisted, its population might be annihilated. If another surrendered, it was often spared. The body counts thus became a form of propaganda, broadcast across continents to ensure that many towns would open their gates without a fight. So we stand again before the strange duality. Were these numbers true, or were they thunder made flesh in the scribe's ink? What is certain is that entire landscapes were scarred, generations extinguished, and civilizations reshaped by the Mongols' passage. Whether millions truly perished or not, the myth of Mongol death arithmetic was powerful enough to haunt history itself. Crusades, crosses, and the counting of souls. By the time Europe launched its crusades toward the Holy Land, the arithmetic of death had taken on a distinctly theological flavor. Numbers were no longer just tallies of the slain. They were woven into sermons, made proof of divine favor or punishment. When the Crusaders seized Jerusalem in 1099, the chronicler Raymond of Aguilers recorded that the city was awash in blood, rising to the ankles of men as they walked the streets. His fellow historian, Fulcher of Chartres, echoed the claim with a flourish: 70,000 Muslims and Jews killed in a single siege. Was it truly that many? Probably not. The figure may have doubled, tripled, even quintupled what actually happened. But for the Crusaders, the number was not meant to be forensic, it was meant to be biblical. In their rhetoric, each corpse was a soul lifted as testimony to God's will. The higher the count, the more clearly heaven had stamped approval upon the Christian conquest. In sermons back home, the figures were repeated with thunderous joy. Death here was not merely an outcome, it was a spectacle, staged for divine audiences. The Muslims, too, recorded their share of numbers. Chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir wrote of crusaders sweeping through the Levant with massacres in the tens of thousands, while later writers inflated or deflated depending on whether they sought to honor martyrs or cast infidels as butchers. The battlefield became a theater of exaggeration, where numbers were swords sharper than steel. But then came a reckoning of another kind. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, body counts escaped human hands altogether. Chroniclers estimated that 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe perished, tens of millions of lives erased by a plague carried by fleas and trade routes. Unlike the numbers of war, these counts were not padded to boast or frighten. If anything, they were understated, for no scribe could keep up with the pace of death when entire towns vanished before ink could dry. In war, numbers had been tools of power. In plague, they became cries of despair. The arithmetic of the Crusades and the Black Death revealed the two faces of medieval counting, one bent on proving the favor of heaven, the other straining to measure the abyss when heaven seemed silent. Conquistadors and the arithmetic of empire. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, they carried steel, fire, and diseases the indigenous had never known. Here, numbers of death reached heights so staggering that they defied comprehension, even by the chroniclers who tried to preserve them. Take Hernán Cortés, whose conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1519 to 1521 was recorded with both triumph and horror. The final siege of Tenochtitlan, the shimmering island capital, ended with streets piled high in corpses. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a conquistador who later wrote his memoirs, described thousands dead each day as starvation, thirst, and plague mingled with Spanish swords. After the fall, estimates claim 200,000 Aztecs perished in that campaign alone. Perhaps more, perhaps less, but always staggering. Then came Francisco Pizarro in Peru. With a handful of men, he ambushed the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1532 at Cajamarca. Contemporary accounts boast that 7,000 Incas were killed in a single afternoon, while not one Spaniard perished. The battle was less a clash of armies than a massacre, a sudden collision between cavalry and cannon against a people unfamiliar with either. But beyond the battlefield, the body counts grew far darker. Diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, swept through the Americas with a speed unmatched by any sword. Entire empires collapsed before Spanish soldiers reached their borders. Some scholars estimate that 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century following contact, tens of millions of lives erased by microbes invisible to the naked eye. And yet, the chroniclers of empire wrote of these deaths in strange, cold arithmetic. For some, it was divine providence, proof that God had cleared the land for Christian dominion. For others, like Bartolomé de las Casas, it was a crime of near-apocalyptic scale, an act of human cruelty compounded by fate. He wrote of Caribbean islands once thriving with hundreds of thousands of people, reduced within decades to silence, their villages reclaimed by jungle. Unlike Alexander or Caesar, the conquistadors did not stand and boast of hundreds of thousands slain by their swords. Instead, they stood amidst empty fields and silent cities, claiming lands where the dead outnumbered the living. It was the age when conquest learned to wear the mask of inevitability, when genocide was cloaked in sermons and royal decrees. The arithmetic of empire was not one of battles, it was one of disappearances, of subtracting entire civilizations from the world map. Mughal emperors and the mathematics of massacre. In India, the Mughal emperors wrapped conquest in poetry, marble palaces, and jeweled courts. Yet behind the elegance of the Taj Mahal and the gardens of Delhi lay numbers that spoke of darker legacies. The Mughal founder Babur wrote his memoirs with a curious mix of candor and pride. He recorded battles not just in terms of victory, but in numbers: 16,000 killed here, 40,000 slain there. At the Battle of Kanwa in 1527, where Babur faced the Rajput Confederacy, contemporary accounts claim that more than 100,000 perished, a mixture of warriors and civilians caught in the storm. His grandson Akbar the Great, often remembered as a tolerant ruler who welcomed Hindus, Christians, and Muslims into his court, could be merciless in war. In 1568, at the siege of Chittorgarh, after the fort fell, Akbar ordered the massacre of 30,000 civilians who had refused to submit. He recorded it not with sorrow, but with the clinical precision of an administrator, as though it were a ledger entry in the book of empire. And then there was Aurangzeb, the empire's most austere ruler, whose campaigns against the Deccan kingdoms stretched for decades. His chroniclers wrote of hundreds of thousands of casualties, as famine and exhaustion bled entire provinces. Though he expanded Mughal lands to their greatest extent, he left behind a trail of depopulated regions where villages once flourished. The Mughal body counts were rarely boasted of in speeches the way Alexander or Caesar did. Instead, they were tucked into court chronicles, preserved by historians who wrote in florid Persian, balancing lines of poetry with lines of death. Battles were celebrated in verse. The river ran red, they wrote. And the moon wept over the fortress walls. The numbers themselves, tens of thousands, sometimes more, sat in the margins like footnotes to glory. But the mathematics of massacre did not belong to the Moguls alone. Across the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire carved its own bloody tally. At the siege of Constantinople in 1453, chroniclers described the bodies of defenders and civilians alike littering the breach. Some sources estimate 50,000 dead, though numbers blur between legend and reality. Later, at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, the Ottomans crushed the Hungarians, killing perhaps 20,000 soldiers in a single day. To Sultan Suleiman, it was a triumph of destiny. To Europe, it was a warning that the crescent moon had eclipsed the Christian cross. In both East and West, the rulers kept count not merely to boast, but to justify. Numbers of the slain became a kind of political arithmetic, proof of divine favor, of martial strength, of inevitability. To conquer without leaving a body count was no conquest at all. The chroniclers sharpened their quills and inked the sums into history, as if humanity itself could be reduced to columns of addition. Europe's age of endless counting. If antiquity and the Middle Ages had taught chroniclers to measure glory in heaps of slain foes, then the 17th century perfected the art of arithmetic misery. Europe entered a season of near unbroken war, and with it came a fresh obsession with numbers, both as propaganda and as grim record. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, is often remembered less for singular battles and more for its unrelenting attrition. Here, casualty figures ceased to belong solely to the battlefield. Chroniclers counted not just soldiers cut down, but civilians starved, displaced, or consumed by plague. A battle might kill 10,000 in a day, but famine, following the armies like a shadow, would claim twice that in a month. By its end, estimates suggest that over 8 million people perished across the German states. Whether the exact number was 7, 8, or 9 million mattered little. What mattered was the acknowledgement that half of some regions' populations had vanished. In villages, they kept count not by headstones, but by the sudden emptiness of streets where children once played. Meanwhile, in England, the civil wars between Parliament and Crown from 1642 to 1651 tallied their own figures. Chroniclers calculated perhaps 200,000 dead, a staggering portion of the population at the time. What makes these numbers striking is that they were written not as distant myth, but as disputes within pamphlets and broadsheets, each side inflating or deflating losses to cast themselves as either righteous martyrs or victorious avengers. Elsewhere, in France, the wars of religion left behind their own infamous body counts. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, though preceding the 30 Years' War, set the stage. Thousands of Huguenots slaughtered in Paris, with estimates ranging from 3,000 to 30,000. To Catholics, it was divine cleansing. To Protestants, it was apocalypse made flesh. Both kept their own tally, and both accused the other of falsifying the sum. The numbers swelled with each retelling, as if words themselves could raise the dead. What was a massacre of 3,000 became 10, and then 20, as chroniclers sought to shock, horrify, or justify. In this, the arithmetic of death became a rhetorical weapon, numbers sharpened into swords of persuasion. Yet alongside the ledgers of blood were quieter reckonings. Parish priests, keeping baptismal and burial registers, noted the absences with weary hands. A line of entries might suddenly stop for a year. Too many deaths to record, too much chaos to make ink meaningful. The body counts of the wars were not just in the tallies of kings and generals, but in the silences of forgotten parish books. It was in this age that Europe began to recognize something both terrifying and novel, the concept of total war, where the line between soldier and civilian blurred, and where the scale of the dead could only be measured in nations rather than battlefields. And yet, the chroniclers still clung to their numbers. They whispered of 10,000 dead in one city, 20,000 in another, until the figures themselves became a kind of chant, a liturgy for a continent drenched in blood. Conquests without end. As Europe's wars bled its own soil, the colonial age carried the arithmetic of death across oceans. The body counts of antiquity and medieval Europe, vast though they seemed, would pale beside the reckonings of conquest in the New World, Africa, and Asia. Here, the numbers often defied comprehension, not battles of tens of thousands, but collapses measured in millions. The arrival of Columbus in 1492 had opened gates not merely to exploration, but to epidemics and empires. The peoples of the Caribbean were among the first to vanish. In Hispaniola, chroniclers claimed 300,000 souls lived upon the island when Spaniards first anchored there. Within a generation, fewer than 20,000 remained. Some were worked to exhaustion in mines, others died from war, most perished from smallpox, influenza, and measles, diseases carried across the sea, invisible and unstoppable. Here, the body count was not counted at all in battle reports, but in silences, abandoned fields, empty villages, and languages that no longer had speakers. Then came the vast heart of the Americas. The Aztec Empire, conquered by Hernán Cortés and his soldiers, saw the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, a battle where perhaps 100,000 were killed in siege and starvation. But it was only the beginning. Within decades, waves of disease scoured central Mexico, reducing a population of 25 million to scarcely 2 million. Chroniclers struggled to tally the dead. One friar wrote that, "So many corpses lay that we could not count them, nor even bury them, for they covered the earth." Further south, the Inca Empire collapsed under Francisco Pizarro and his men. The Spaniards numbered in the mere hundreds, yet by war, betrayal, and plague, they presided over the destruction of an empire that stretched thousands of miles. Some accounts suggest 90% of the Andean population perished within a century, tens of millions of lives extinguished, their stories recorded only in fragments by chroniclers who, in truth, could not fathom the scale. Elsewhere, the slave trade carved its own cruel arithmetic. Historians estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, over 12 million Africans were forced aboard ships bound for the Americas. Of these, perhaps 2 million died during the Middle Passage alone, their bodies consigned to the Atlantic depths. Counting was imprecise, deliberately obscured by merchants whose ledgers reduced lives to cargo. A line of numbers, written in ink, could represent an entire village emptied, an entire family severed. In Asia, conquest too left numbers. The Mughal Empire's campaigns in India, the expansion of the Ottoman frontiers, and the wars of the Qing dynasty all brought accounts of battles where tens of thousands fell in single days. Chroniclers noted them with the same grim efficiency. 40,000 slain, 100,000 scattered. But it was in the colonial age that body counts grew not just larger, but colder. No longer merely battlefield boasts, they became statistical reports, annexed to empires' bureaucracies. Death was tabulated alongside exports of silver and sugar, as though the loss of entire peoples were part of an accountant's ledger. And yet, even amid such staggering numbers, chroniclers never lost their tendency to exaggerate, to manipulate. A victory might inflate its enemy's deaths fivefold, an atrocity might shrink under careful penmanship. In this way, the colonial era perfected both mass death and the art of disguising it. It left us not merely stories of soldiers fallen, but the haunting recognition that numbers can erase faces as easily as they reveal horrors. The arithmetic of silence. From the dust of ancient battlefields to the plagues of empires, from crusaders' boasts to conquistadors' ledgers, history has carried a strange obsession, not merely telling us that people died, but how many. The body counts, that echo across ages, were more than tallies. They were weapons of memory, meant to frighten enemies, glorify kings, or justify conquest. A Roman senator might record that 300,000 Gauls fell in a single campaign. A chronicler in Baghdad might write of 70,000 Christians slain in a crusader siege. A colonial official might reduce millions to a few rows in a ledger. The numbers often lied, but they were believed. And once believed, they became as real as the corpses themselves. What is most haunting is not the exaggeration but the coldness. Behind every statistic was a child pulled from a mother's arms, a village emptied, a battlefield of broken shields left to the crows. Yet time collapses them into single figures, as though the human soul could be measured like grain in a sack. Historians now debate these numbers. Were the Mongols' massacres truly in the millions? Did Alexander's conquests really leave whole nations emptied? How many lives did the transatlantic slave trade extinguish? Precision often escapes us. What remains is an uneasy truth. Our ancestors lived in a world where the value of a life was too often measured by how easily it could be counted and forgotten. And yet, within these grim tallies lies a paradox. The very act of recording, even when exaggerated, even when cruel, means the dead were not entirely erased. To read of them now is to remember. To speak of them, even as numbers, is to allow their shadows to step once more across the stage of history. Perhaps that is the lesson buried within the craziest body counts of antiquity and beyond. They remind us that history is not only about emperors, generals, or victories, but about the uncounted multitudes who paid the price. They remind us that silence, too, has an arithmetic, the lives not tallied, the names not written, the memories not kept. And if we, centuries later, still recoil at the enormity of those numbers, then perhaps it means they have achieved something after all. They whisper to us across time, do not forget that we lived. Do not forget that we died. And do not reduce us to numbers alone.